Paul actually has been instrumental in many things that I worked on personally, so I'm very grateful to him. Paul has been extremely helpful for licensing IP, so I have personal relationship with him as well. So, and Paul's somewhat also familiar with the class. This is for the students. Really take advantage of the collective expertise and experience that you see on Zoom today. This is a unique opportunity for you because you don't get to spend this sort of intimate time with these folks who are not only local, including Paul, and we will get to the panel shortly, but they're extremely successful entrepreneurs. So they've actually done what you are dreaming to do. So let's definitely take advantage of the time that they have provided for us. But first, we'll have a brief overview of resources at the U related to innovation and entrepreneurship, which I think is very important because all of this is available to you as a U student and someone affiliated with the university. So I highly recommend everyone to pay attention, not only pay attention, but also think about how you can exploit these resources in the ideas that you're thinking about, not only as part of this class, but broadly as well. But Paul, the floor is yours. I'll mute myself.
Thank you, Rajesh. And thanks to everybody who's here. Given I'm sharing my screen, I can't see all the students. So I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage, my first time doing a Zoom sort of class like this. Speak up, interrupt, put notes in a note box, or Rajesh, you interrupt me. I tend to talk way too much, and you're not here to listen to me so much as everybody else.
David, I will also add that if anyone has questions, you can also put on the chat box and I'll monitor it as well. Paul, you don't have to, I'll monitor it for you.
Sweet.
Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. So everybody, thank you very much. I hope you know by Rajesh's excitement and my excitement, this is probably one of the most challenging things that a university engages in because it's not based on science, it's based on people. And every person is different, every person brings something different to it. And so for that reason, I know, as Rajesh said, I think we have a warm friendship, a warm relationship. That doesn't mean Rajesh and I have not seen, diametrically opposed views of things. And that doesn't mean we haven't seen absolutely the same view of things. One of the most insightful things somebody once said to me about this space, and in particular about entrepreneurship, there's no job description for an entrepreneur. It is whatever somebody makes of it. And everybody views it a little differently. My path to here involves working for the federal government for 7 years, working for startups in New York City, in Uzbekistan, working for universities in California, now Utah. I've been in finance, I've been in construction, I've been in telecom, I've been in project management. There's just, it's a wide open thing. And I hope that you know from Rajesh's experience, my enthusiasm, what you're going to hear from David, Melissa, Phil, and Kevin later. It's if you have a passion, jump in and just see where it takes you. So with that, I will say I bring an exuberance that's not typically common in a bureaucracy in a university setting. I will try and put my straitjacket on a little bit and be disciplined. How do I get to the next slide? There. So an overview. Rajesh, he and I haven't spoken. TVC has transformed, has metamorphosized, and we are now Pivot Center. Pivot is Partners for Innovation, Ventures, Outreach, and Technology. So what that means is I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional tech commercialization, which you see as the third bullet, second thing there. But I want to talk more about innovation management, because that's really what we're involved in, is looking at how we take the research and the inventions and the great intellectual capacity that's housed within the university and we somehow engage the economy on that sort of foundation, those terms. That requires incredible partnerships between us, industry, and government. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to catalyze innovation that leads to economic engagement and impact. So that's the conceptual framework for it. So stepping back, TVC, traditional tech transfer to traditional tech commercialization, was very linear, right? You all students, Rajesh, great minds, you guys invent. That's what you do. It's your intellectual curiosity and your great capacity for seeing things through different eyes. You invent, right? TVC traditionally licensed what you invented. That might be to a startup company. It might be to an existing company. Take, you name it. I talk about dinosaurs, but maybe now we should talk about Facebook, Apple, those kind of, I'll show my age. So we would license. There needed to be some bridge there. So there needed to be an understanding between invention and license, invention and business. And that was another role that we tried to play, was to say, just because it works in the lab doesn't mean somebody will buy it. There's a lot that has to happen in there. And so that was training and engagement, developing relationships with faculty. That was then trying to manage agreements, manage intellectual property, patents, which we'll talk quite a bit about, right? And that was understanding and being able to talk the language of business. David, Melissa, Phil, and Kevin speak a very, very different language than any PhD research scientist I've ever worked with. So what happened then was looking at it in terms of innovation management, not just a licensing a technology. There needed to be a lot of things that sort of bridge that gap. And so we've created an incredible in-residence program, and everyone is part of that in-residence program. But it's the entrepreneurs themselves who are actually looking for their next gig. They're looking for something they can license and create a company around it. So we had to find those people and engage those people and convince them to work with us. Then we needed to support them as they created companies, because not everybody's done this 7 times, right? So a lot of relationships that get established with lawyers or with accountants or with web designers, with regulatory consultants, right? Not everybody knows everything when they start a company. Some people do it for the first or second time. We also needed to find people that could just advise and mentor, coach, and teach, that could be a trusted partner, but weren't on payroll. They weren't looking to have equity. They weren't looking to have a board seat. They weren't looking to get a consulting contract. They just were people in a network as entrepreneurs starting a company, building that network where they could bounce ideas off of. Then there's also scaling. So every company starts as 1-2 people, but every company needs to find talent and resources. That's really hard, especially in a market like Utah where resources are really tight. 3% unemployment, all kinds of things. So how can we go beyond traditional licensing to try and help build those broader networks and be a resource ourselves? Of course, there's funding. So often the tech needs to be developed before an investor will see the potential. So that very initial funding, that friends and family, that first angel funding, right? Very early, that's often before there's a product. And that's often the hardest money to get, because you have to convince somebody that you're not crazy. And so we've worked to try and provide some of that very early funding for tech development and for sort of, maybe a first hire or something. And then that access to research and innovation, that's just broadening it out. So as the company begins to expand, it's always about a patent portfolio. If you guys are coders, your first code is never the code you go to market with. The code you go to market with is never the code that you end with, right? For some of the research that Rajesh is doing, He can figure out how to arrange the nanoparticles XYs, but he's got to invent a new instrument to be able to arrange the particles YYs, right? So there's always this expanded research and this expanded innovation. How do we facilitate that and begin to speak the language of all the people? Where we are now, because we've been doing that for a while, the group that's at TVC has been here about 3.5, 4 years, although TVC has been in existence since 1969. So we've sort of really honed in on those first two that are now in shadow, and now we're going beyond that. Now we're saying, what more can we do? So we've created 3 accelerators: software, medical device, and therapeutics. Those accelerators take technologies, add funding, bring in talent, and they get the technology further along towards product before putting it in a company, so that we don't saddle the company with all that responsibility too early. An incubator, we have a wet lab incubator. We have facilities now where you can co-locate with the U. We've brought in more work to bring in corporate philanthropy, so that a foundation looking to find a cure for some childhood disease knows that they can partner with a researcher, partner with programmers, partner, locate here, right? So all these extra things we've done in the 3rd column get to the 4th column. How do we explore professional development ideas, work with industry, provide this training and support, all towards what we talked about early on, going back, right? Bridging that innovation, and the impact is getting it into the economy. So that's what this 4th column is all about. And so TVC has really gone from the 1st column we talked about in shadow to now encompassing this whole thing. And that's why we've rebranded and why we're expanding so much. So I don't want to rattle. I'm going to go really quickly through this. Intellectual property is the basis. If I'm going to sell something, I want to have a competitive advantage. And one of the ways I get a competitive advantage is to say, I, whomever you are, Rajesh, right? Rajesh, student, I invented this. This is new. It is recognized in the Constitution and by USPTO or foreign intellectual property organizations. It is recognized that I created it and I have rights to use it. That protection is so important, because if you can't get that protection, then you have competitors immediately, and those competitors could be better funded, they could better resourced, they could be better experienced, they could be better all kinds of things. So the intellectual property is the core of what we do. When we talk tech-based economic development or a tech startup, we're not talking tech as in code, we're talking tech as in intellectual property. It can be code, but it's not necessarily only code. It's much bigger, right? So this is the economist talking about something that allowed all of this to take place. I'll give a second to read it. Rajesh, when you shake your head, I'll move on. When you tell me you've read it. And now I put him on the spot. Now he has to read it. He read it. You've had plenty of time. Don't worry. You're off the hook. All right. So it was this thing called Bayh-Dole. It was legislation. How can the federal government help? This is one of the ways the federal government could help. What it said is, back, what's this, 40 years ago? 40 years ago, we didn't have the economy we had now. Probably most of you students weren't born, right? So what happened then was the federal government funded most of the research, and the federal government owned it because it paid for it. But what happens when the federal government owns technology that it paid for that somebody else did? Well, I'm behind my, here, let's skip all that. What happened was the federal government accumulated 28,000 patents, and they all sat on the shelf. It's the proverbial, it gets invented and put on the shelf, right? So with Bayh-Dole, what Bayh-Dole did was said, no, we're not going to own it. All these things, all these types of IP, patents and copyrights, if you guys code it, if you guys invent it, you, the university, is going to own it. Okay, that's fantastic. But what do we do with it, right? Well, let's say, okay, let's be clear who the inventor is. This is what determines invention. Once you own it, you file for that IP, right? Before you disclose, make sure you get your IP. So you can go back and look through the slides, that's fine. We're going to let the university push it into the marketplace. So 28,000 patents, 5% licensed. Since 1980, 40 years, they said, university, you own it, but you have the responsibility to try and find a licensee, to find an entrepreneur, to find a Facebook or a Google to take it. So just since 1996, right, the first 16 years, we'll say it was a little slow out of the gate. Really, I don't have the numbers. So just in the last 14 years, we go from 280,000, 28,000 patents, 5 times more patents, all kinds of startups, all kinds of drugs. We have, 10% of that is now drugs developed, vaccines through public-private partnerships, right? It's unheard of, but this is the money slide, right? $1.7 trillion worth of economic impact in just 11 years. I think I can't see my own slide because you guys are up. Was it 5.9 million jobs, right? That's the money slide. That's why this office pivot exists. That's why we work with Rajesh. That's why we try and bridge those gaps, right? So that's in the US. Just us here, we have 1,300 active patents that somebody could come and say, hey, that's exactly what I'm looking for to build a company, to build a new product. 75 a year. We punch well above our weight. I think we have 500 million in research funding this year. We have over 100 startups in our portfolio, and I can't see a show of hands, but I wonder who knew, right? Myriad, BioFire, and Recursion all came out of here. So there you go, Jeff. So the PCR technology that we all talk about that enables us to test whether or not we have COVID, that was invented here at the U. The people who used it, it was Idaho Technologies. They had a vacuum cleaner and potatoes. And that led, literally, that simple, led to the invention of PCR, which enables us to screen and know whether we have COVID and a host of other things, right? That they've probably returned to the university $100 million since they licensed that technology. And I gotta believe, I don't know how many, it's a couple dozen technologies that they've continued to license us from us over the years. Recursion is the newest unicorn. They just passed $1 billion, privately held still, just passed $1 billion. A guy named Chris got his degree here. I think he dropped out of the graduate program to start this, and they now are over at the Gateway with several hundred employees and $1 billion valuation, right? He was a student just like you guys 10 years ago, 7 years ago, right? It's absolutely crazy. So this comes down for us. When do we know we've succeeded? We've succeeded when there's something invented here that creates a public benefit, right? We've succeeded when we can engage with you as faculty and students and bring your ideas to the market. That helps us reward you financially, reward you professionally and personally, but also helps you want to stay here. In order to do that, we have to have closer ties to industry and investors. It's all meant for this growth, right? And at the end of the day, it's all education, and so it's all part of what the university does. So that's it. I'm blank. Rajesh, let the important people talk now.
Well, thank you. I would quick comment. These are resources that are completely available to you. So I don't know, walk you through, if you didn't have, say, as an invention, what is a typical path? Maybe very briefly, do you want to just say, like, what happens in a typical situation?
For an invention, sorry, you froze. So walk through a
Yeah.
typical invention process.
Yeah. So imagine
Fantastic.
one of the students has a clever idea and has tested it and looks good. What do they do in a successful situation?
Sure. So, what we would, in an ideal world, what we would love to happen, right? So let's take Melissa. So Melissa has a great background, entrepreneur, finance. Melissa understands markets, right? So let's take healthcare, IT, somewhere software, or simple med device. So what, in an ideal world, you'd reach out to us now as a researcher, inventor, student. We don't own student IP, so it's tiny different. We own just grad student and faculty, because it's if we pay your salary, right?
Yeah.
So you reach out to her and you say, I'm working on something. And I really think that it might have a commercial application. Really love to get your viewpoints. So we organize, Melissa has an hour conversation, you guys talk about it, and you say, holy shit, I didn't understand that. Now I do. I have a much better perspective. So I'm going to spend X amount of time, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, and I'm going to reduce this idea of mine down a little bit, right? And I think I've now invented something. I think that this is something that doesn't exist. And it may be that you already have a prototype. It may be before you have a prototype. When you think your idea is something that nobody else has done and you can reduce it to, being able to put it on paper at least, then you contact us. That's the invention disclosure, right? You disclose it to us, and we do 3 things. We re-engage people like Melissa and others, right? And we look at the market, we look at the IP landscape, we do a prior art search, and then we look at how, if we do get this to market, what's the funding need? We take those 3 things and we come back and we say, we can protect it. There's a market for it. Somebody will buy it. And we can figure out how to fund the progression. So based on that, we come back to you as the inventor and we say, here's how it all works. This is what it would look like if we try and commercialize this. We're going to pursue IP. We're going to pursue it in the US and Europe. We're going to pursue it here, not here, right? We create that IP strategy and we go over it with you. We say, right now, doesn't make sense, or it does make sense to try and license it based on who's going to fund it and how long it's going to take to develop the technology, right? And so we work with you on that strategy to find the money, to find the people, and determine whether it stays in the lab for a little bit more research and development, or if it gets spun out and licensed for, to be funded and taken along there. Then let's just say it's in the lab. We work with you to find grants or corporate partners, those types of things. If we spin it out and put it in a startup, we work to help find an entrepreneur who wants to, be the licensee, create the company. We work with you to identify angels or other investors, and we put it in there. And then we allow you as the inventor to develop your relationship with that startup. How much time do you want to spend? Do you want to stay in the university? Do you want to go into the startup exclusively? Do you want to consult? Do you want to have more role on board and management, strategic? Do you just want to be an inventor, right? So it's all this bit about what's best for the technology that we know somebody will invest in and somebody else will buy when it's ready. And then how do we work to support both your research and your personal career aspirations to go along that continuum? Hopefully that was not too high level.
No, I think it's perfect. So from a student's perspective, so these students, who are young, they can take risks, hopefully. So from their perspective, they can come to any of you at TVC, Pivot Center, as a partner for assisting them in trying to commercialize their innovation. I suppose that's a succinct way of saying what you're doing. But you can guide them through this process.
And I would say for undergraduate students, Lassonde is probably your first step, because you own your IP. To work with us, what you would do, we can work with you. You'd assign us the IP, and then we would license it back to somebody. But yes, between us, for undergraduate students, the two of us can really partner to help create that knowledge and that pathway.
Great. So we do have a mix of undergrads and graduate students in this class. So that also makes it much more interesting.
Yeah, grad students come to us.
Right. So are there any questions for Paul before we jump into the panel from the students? I don't see anything in the chat. If not, I would say, no, I don't hear anybody. So we should jump right into our expert panels. And again, I'm extremely grateful for all of you for taking the time. And anyone, feel free to jump in. But I would say, let's start with some brief introductions. And as I said in my email to all of you, maybe we can go in alphabetical order. And then we'll have some Q&A. And to the students and anyone else in the audience, feel free to think about questions to ask, especially from your own experience and how your career can be enhanced by the experiences of these experts that we have here. So again, really think carefully and ask questions. And this is your opportunity to ask even naive questions, right? Now, no one knows everything. I'm probably the first one who asks the most naive questions. And this is something I learned from my graduate training. Don't be shy, ask away. So I will say, let's start with Melissa Philippon. Do you want to?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Rajesh, and nice to see all of you and meet those of you I haven't met yet. So my name is Melissa Florin. I usually work under Florin, my maiden name. My married name is Philippon, so that's why I have a lot of names up there. My background is a little strange. I went to college at Princeton back east and studied politics and East Asian studies. So nothing to do with what I ended up doing. And when I was there at the time, this is a long time ago in the 1900s, the only people that recruited were bankers. And so the only jobs that came to Princeton were all the iBanks. And so I was lucky enough to have done an internship in investment banking the summer prior to graduating to know that that was a terrible job I didn't want. So I had to get scrappy to try to find something else to do. And I got a little lucky. I found a job in San Francisco working on the buy side straight out of undergrad, which means I was working for a large mutual fund company, basically picking stocks. So these were public companies. So I specialized in tiny little companies. They were called, our hedge fund was called the Orphan Fund. I was often the only person calling on these CEOs. And when we bought or traded these stocks, you could see it because nobody else was buying or trading stocks. And it was fun, but I didn't know anything. And I learned on the job what inventory was and the whole thing. So it was an incredible learning opportunity. And then I went to a different mutual fund company called Janus Funds in Denver, where I was also an equity analyst. There I focused on small companies, still not as small, thank goodness, but mostly on healthcare, because that's where my interest lied. When I was your age, I wanted to be a doctor and did pre-med for a long time. And so ended up at least talking to a lot of doctors in my research. So I worked there for a while and loved it. I was there when we went public, and I was there for the .com bubble and burst, which was incredible because we were managing, when I was there, I think we went from 30 billion under management to 330 billion under management in the 5 years that I was there. So that was kind of a crazy experience. I left to go back east to join a healthcare focused hedge fund. So still picking stocks, mostly public. At that point, I started doing some private deals too, but still mostly public. And after about 10 years of the same kind of job, more or less, I felt a lot of envy for the entrepreneurs. So I felt I was sitting back kind of judging them, not having really done anything except for go to college. And so I wanted to join them. And one of our consultants was a very famous oncologist at this hedge fund. And he called me with a business idea. And I was like, I love this idea. I love it. Let's do it. And so I helped him and this geneticist start a company. And I left the buy side and became I think they called me the founding employee. Technically, I wasn't a founder. And we raised money, and I hired the whole management team and ended up growing that business until we sold it. We sold it too early. We can get it to the mistakes section. And then I went to a company in Utah, which is one of the reasons we came out here, which we're so lucky we did. And it's a healthcare services company. And I worked there. I ran business development and customer success, AKA the complaint department, until we sold that company to Water Street Capital. And then I started consulting for a few companies, one of which was a total disaster, others of which have been really fun. And I became friends with Paul and David and have really enjoyed conversations with professors like Rajesh who are innovating and have had so much fun doing that work. And I'm actually working on a startup of my own, but I don't have the patents filed yet, so I can't talk about it. And that's me. And I'd love to field any questions about anything. So thanks again for having me.
Awesome, thank you. That's quite an illustrious career, and I'm eager to. I'm curious about the mistake. That's what I want to learn from personally. Kevin, you're on.
Hi, Rajesh, and hi, everyone. Rajesh, thanks for having me involved with this. My experience is probably a little bit different than most. I grew up inside an entrepreneurial family and also have spent a lot of time in the corporate world. My last gig was running a global enterprise for one of the water drilling companies where I ran a $300 million business. So I've got to see both sides, what it's like to be an entrepreneur where you literally have to do everything, and being in the corporate world where you have a lot of resources, but with those resources come bureaucracy and restrictions. And so seeing both sides has been really, really helpful to me. I tell you, I love to build things. And so I think that's where my entrepreneurial roots go really, really deep. I love to take things from concept of an idea all the way to something that somebody really uses in their lives to make things better. What I've chosen to do as my capstone and how I ended up getting involved with TVC was once I left my last gig, I wanted to have a capstone where I actually went back to my entrepreneurial roots and really worked on things that mattered to sustainability, whether it's environmental sustainability or the sustainability of people in their livelihoods, et cetera. And so that's where I focus my time now. I have a little startup that's more like a holding company where we take ideas in and look at them and decide whether they're worth moving forward or not. And the concept is, if it's going to fail, let it fail fast, because you want to take and make sure you have measly amount of resources. You don't want to spend a lot of time and effort in something that may not make it. And I've seen some great ideas where the product market fit wasn't quite right, where great idea, it worked really well, but it missed the market by 25-fold in terms of cost. Never going to get there, time to stop, move on to the next one. And so that's where I spend my time doing. One of the things I think that's really important at being an entrepreneur is to find out something you really love and you're really passionate about. And let's put it all aside and say, most people are not going to develop a Facebook or a Google or whatever. Those are the sort of the unicorns that are really up there. Find a business that you would like to run for a long time, because a lot of lifestyle businesses turn off a lot of good opportunities, not only for the owner, but for all the people that work there. And so if you build your business like that and you happen to find the situation where someone wants to buy it, it's even that much better. I've had that experience. I ran a family business for 25 years. We ended up selling it to Bort Longyear, which is in the Valley. After running it for 25 years, didn't expect it to come, but it was a strategic buy, and we went on to do the next thing. So if you have that kind of mindset where you're building something for yourself first and then take the lagniappe later, it's a good place to be. Obviously, if you have a great idea that needs to scale and you need resources and help, that's where the venture capitalists will help you out a lot. But I've been very blessed to have a really fun career, and I like opportunities like this to give back to you folks and talk more about things. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, definitely. I think your connections to sustainability makes a lot of sense, because a lot of the projects that students are working on are very much related to that, and clearly the challenges are pretty huge. By the way, it's interesting you mentioned the issue of failing quickly. I recently read that Quibble was the fastest failing startup that raised a lot of money. I think they failed in 4 months or something, which is an interesting study in the business school, I'm sure.
Earning $2 billion in 4 months takes a lot of work.
Yeah. So,
yeah. How to waste other people's money really quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
David, it's yours. Up 10.
Hey guys, yeah, I'm David Noteware, and I guess if you look at my career, it's kind of evidenced by a lack of focus. I seem to move from topic to topic. Maybe that's because I get bored. I'm not sure why. But in contrast to what Kevin was just saying, I build companies not with the idea of running them for any extended period of time, but to build them up to some sort of critical mass, and then I sell them. So I have founded and sold 4 separate companies at this point. The most recent one was in November of last year. I bought a company, cleaned it up, and then sold it in May. So that was the fastest. So 7 months we sold it. And that particular one was a 28 times return in 7 months. But so my background is I actually, like Melissa, studied international comparative economic development undergrad, which sounds really cool, but you can't really get a job doing that. So then I went to law school and was a lawyer for 5 years, and then went back to business school at Wharton, and then have been founding technology-enabled startups ever since in a variety of industries. The first one was in finance technology, and then I did one in chip-to-chip communication, and then I did one in litigation support. It was technology-enabled because we used streaming video as the market differentiator. And the last one was in consumer products. We made gizmos you put on the end of a hose to wash a motorcycle. I mean, in contrast to what Kevin was saying, I'm deeply indifferent about the industry because for me, it's a game to build stuff. I like at companies like Legos, and you build them up, and when you mess something up, you break it back down, then you rebuild it, and that happens a lot. And then when it gets big enough and can stand on its own, we sell it. And honestly, for me, I know when to sell the company. There's a functional aspect and then like an emotional aspect. Because when it gets to be about 80 people, I don't know everybody's name anymore. And once I stop knowing everybody's name, it's time for me to go. That's how I kind of gauge it. But what I'm doing now is I work with TVC, helping shepherd the companies that come out of the U. I've worked with Rajesh on some of his projects. I also teach entrepreneurial finance in the Eccles School, and I've most recently started a venture fund. I've kind of gone to the dark side in some ways, and what we're doing is buying companies that are at risk of going out of business because of COVID. And have our first couple of those lined up. It's not a huge fund, and we didn't take any institutional money because institutions are a pain in the rear. And so it's not a huge fund by some folks' standards, but it's just more like a friends group for investing, but it is set up as a fund. And we're buying companies that got blown up by COVID that with additional runway will recover. And the economics of doing that can be really quite good for us. So yeah, so that's what I'm doing right now. I'm kind of all over the place because that's the way I like it. And if you ask my kids what I do, they really can't answer very well. But that's okay with me. But I've got lots of experiences that we can talk about where we've made some just horrifically bad mistakes.
Great. Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
And I would say, I would also point out, particularly to students, it's really interesting to see that every person is different, and every person's journey to entrepreneurship is different. And this is what really says there are so many, infinite paths to success, right? So this is something that I am actually recognizing in all of you. So it's really interesting and something to point out and celebrate. Phil, sorry, no, last but not the least. Yeah.
No, Rajesh, thank you for inviting me. And frankly, I'm honored to be included with the rest of the panelists. And to the students, this is a super unique opportunity for you because I won't speak for myself, and I actually don't know the other panelists. I know of them, but I don't know them. But I'm going to speak for them and say, you have an audience with people who have done this multiple times, and every one of those people will give you, I'm going to speak for them, they'll give you time if you reach out to them. I mean, they wouldn't be here on this panel having a conversation with you if they weren't excited to talk to people about cool ideas. And if that person's 20 years old, honestly, it's even cooler. Because that means somebody's excited enough to reach out to an old person, right? To get our perspective on something. So this is a super unique opportunity. So definitely write down those names and get on LinkedIn, because it's really special to have that kind of brain power and experience. And when I got my business degree, it was more about the experience of the people that I got my degree with. It had nothing to do with the degree itself. I had a mechanical engineering undergrad, so business school wasn't particularly challenging because I'd gone through a technical degree, but the value was all in the people. So make sure you leverage your network and you start doing that as early as you can, because especially if you start doing entrepreneurial things, that's where you're going to get a huge part of your value. Is someone that you can pick up the phone and say, hey, I've got a question about something. Do you know anything about telecom or whatever it happens to be? Or what David say, squirting things off of motorcycles. Yeah, actually, I do know stuff about squirting things off of motorcycles. So my background's a little bit, I mean, it's kind of like everyone else, a little bit different. I've spent a lot of time in startups all the way through Fortune 200 corporates. And one thing I'll say about entrepreneurship as well, it doesn't necessarily mean doing something on your own. If you find the right, let's call it a corporate opportunity, there are plenty of companies that do have an appetite for trying new things. Now, sometimes the dangers are a little different because companies tend to pay lip service to taking risks, and sometimes you pay the price if they don't work out. But if you go in with eyes wide open, sometimes you can find that balance of actually working for a business, but some of them do have an appetite and a way to actually drive new innovation. So being an entrepreneur doesn't necessarily mean I'm on my own, like I'm living in mom and dad's basement. There are other avenues. There is no path to this. So I've worked for some corporates, some startups that were acquired through corporates, started a company myself and a nonprofit myself. The last 5 years, I was running a company in the UK. And just this spring moved to a board of directors role as we were preparing that business for sale. And so my world is all about trying to figure out what cool and interesting things I'm going to get involved with next. My particular passion is around things that are valuable. And what I mean is there are some people that are experts in commodities or things that are sort of commodities, and they understand sort of commodity marketing, things that are sort of generic products, and they're just experts at grabbing market share. That's actually not my expertise. I'm an expert at things that deliver very particular value to an end customer, and then understanding the market and how you can actually capitalize on that market and make an exchange of money with a customer who is ecstatic about paying, let's call it a premium price for something because they're getting value out of it. So I have a lot of experience around products, product value, business leadership, group leadership, and anything that involves sort of software and technology are things that I have expertise in, and either know people that we can talk to get answers for.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Sounds like I'm looking forward to all your answers. So again, let me just reiterate that the students feel free to jump in, ask questions, put it on chat, or just unmute yourself and ask. I'll kick things off with the first question, and I will ask any of the panelists to volunteer to answer first. what is one mistake in your entrepreneurial career that you made, and more importantly, how would you advise a younger version of yourself to avoid it? And hopefully the students can relate to these, but even if not, I'm sure it'll be a great learning experience. So who wants to take that on?
I've got a simple one, and one that you don't sometimes think about when you and your buddies are sitting around dreaming up ideas. Sometimes the people that you dream up those ideas end up being in business with you for a long time. And it doesn't mean be careful who you go to business with, but definitely pay attention to the people that you are, let's say, strategizing with, because you may end up having relationships with them that go on for decades, and they can be wonderful things. But sometimes you're sitting around over a pizza talking about an idea, and before you know it, 10 years later, you're still in a business with that person. So you need to make sure that, or maybe not make sure is not the right word, but certainly consider that when you're thinking about people that you want to start a business with, that it could potentially be a longer relationship than you had sort of anticipated at the beginning.
I might build on that, in that the relationships you have with your coworkers can last for a long time as well. But likewise, the relationships you build with your funding sources can last for a long time. And it's important to recognize up front that a funding source and you as the entrepreneur or the company receiving that funding have interests that become less than parallel almost immediately. For example, a VC fund has a specified life, and they're already going to start raising their next fund, halfway through the investing period of their existing fund. And there are times when what they need for funding, for raising their next fund out of their investment, i.e. you, won't match what you want as the entrepreneur. Those types of things are pretty easy to anticipate, and they're not bad, okay? They're not bad. VCs are not bad, but their interests are different than the entrepreneurs, and they're not parallel. So if you have some advisors up front that can help you figure out where in the life cycle a VC is and what their experience has been with their previous entrepreneurs, you can do a much better job of choosing your funding sources. Sometimes you don't have the privilege of choosing your funding sources. You only have one option, but nonetheless, if you have more than one, you can choose well. And I'll admit that on at least one occasion, I did not choose well. So I have some battle scars from that. But the point of that was a mistake on my part, is not going and making a bunch of phone calls to vet my funding sources adequately. And so that ended up causing me a lot of grief later, because they behaved in ways that were nonsensical and greedy, and it caused us a lot of grief. So if I were to summarize, you should say that the investors will do due diligence on the companies also should do due diligence on the investors. This is important. Yeah, not just on the fund, but on the individuals who are leading the fund. We had one instance where the lead investor out of a fund got fired, and we ended up with somebody else out of the fund. And that was less than pleasant. And if we had chosen a fund that had more of a track record, like 3-4 funds, and kind of a bench of folks who all saw through the same lens, it would have made our lives way easier. And so we had options, didn't choose the option that would have been more stable, because the other one offered us better valuation. But what we made up, that was a mistake.
Yeah, I've lived through that too, David. I know exactly what you mean. It's about, it's not just your team. You end up reporting to your board of directors and your investors. And if they don't see eye to eye, or they're not strategic thinkers, it can be a really toxic relationship. And then when it works, it can be just like having a whole nother executive team that's working, for you on the sides and making introductions and all of that good stuff. So the mistake that I kind of had thought about is more of a strategic one, which now that you told us a little more about the class probably isn't the right move for this audience. But I would say just something to consider that I've, kind of learned through different chapters of adulting is around, thinking about your job in the context of what kind of life you want to live.
Yeah.
So, when I was in the investing world, I knew flight attendants at United Airlines better than any of my friends. I mean, I was never home. So I was always on the road, different hotel every single night, visiting companies. And so it was a great experience, but it's also kind of a strange way to spend one's 20s. And I realized that I couldn't live like that and also eventually have a family and, dogs and a full life and ski and fly fish, things that matter to me. So, I'm not trying to say like, don't try it, because I wouldn't have had the rest of my career if I hadn't put in that decade of, sweat equity or labor. So it's a tricky one, but I just think that to always kind of think about, how am I spending my life? Because it's a fragile, short thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you on that, actually.
And
Thank you.
Off with my biggest mistake was underestimating how much money and how much time it required for us to get to profitability, and we ultimately ran out of money and had to shut down the operation. And that's a painful one when you have an idea, it's on the right track, but you just simply did not plan well enough ahead to understand what it took.
Yeah, I guess it's also important to acknowledge that I would say 90% of startups fail, right, or something like that, and it's okay to fail, because that's what innovation is about, especially in the US. I think that's what's special about being here. So we really should celebrate that to some extent. But
yeah, I grew up sailing, and one of the lessons we all learned: anybody can sail on a nice, calm day when it's simple. When the weather's really bad and things are really ugly, that's when you really learn how to sail. And it applies to being an entrepreneur just the same way. Is when you have to go through the battle scars of, do you make payroll, all these other things going on. That's the stuff that really builds the character. So failure is a really good teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you. I think this was a very, very interesting discussion, and really appreciate everyone being candid about it. And
Rajesh, one thing I'd also mention is one of the things that's sort of sexy about entrepreneurship is people hear about people raising money, and it's sort of celebrated. I mean, it is celebrated. You see it all the time: raise this million, $500,000, 10 million. But what's actually happening is you've just sold part of your company to someone who now owns part of you. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to recognize that that's a transaction, and there is an alternative. And sometimes you can find a bootstrapping approach where maybe your growth is a little bit slower. And it sounds like David sort of has a lot of experience with this. Sounds like David is maybe more of that guy, right? Where he understands how to build it to something, and then he makes an exchange and he gets out. And the point is, not everybody sells an Uber or Facebook and at the end they own 6% of it, right? Which is a lot, but it's not that much. But you know what? There's a lot of people probably in all these students' neighborhood who have created companies and sold them and maybe early retired that you never hear about, right? And they're the ones fly fishing and skiing. They literally probably have millions of dollars in the bank. They didn't raise any money. And to Melissa's point, their choices about lifestyle actually they have a lot of choices right now, and they're not celebrated on CNBC, right? But they made some. So there are alternatives to raising money and kind of going the really public route, and there's nothing wrong with that either. So you need to make sure that that's part of your consideration, because I think there's a lot of energy being put around, I need to go find some VCs or some angels to get me millions. Well, you've just actually given away parts of your business. And there may be alternatives.
I totally agree with Phil on that one. When my first startup was a company called Navigenics, where I'm glad I can't see the students' faces because it would hurt me to see them nod when I ask them if they've heard of 23andMe, which is also a unicorn. And we were there first, and we were competing against them. Our team were on all the patents for that whole industry, and they ended up beating us because they had unlimited backing from Google. So we were competing against free, and so they went cool and hip. And while I was running trials at the Mayo, thinking that science would win the day, and we weren't. So anyway, it didn't. But the reason I bring it up is that we had kind of a who's who list of investors. I mean, super A-listers like Kleiner Perkins, Sequoia, Mordovidow, Procter and Gamble. Like when we launched our first product, it was like a celebrity event in Soho in New York City, and it still didn't. I just noticed at the time just the waste. Where, when we were hiring a marketing team or doing something, or an executive search firm, or even the lawyers, they had to be like the best in Palo Alto. And I thought to myself often, if we had less money, we would have been much more disciplined and I think scrappier. So that was a lesson. Like, you can have the flashiest A-listers and still it doesn't matter. Sometimes, it can actually be different kind of pressure and actually lead to maybe less.
And when those people put that much money in, Melissa, the pressure this is not trivial. I mean, people have heart attacks, like literally with that kind of pressure, right? And it's not that it's not pressure if you're doing it all on your own, but when people have put tens of millions of dollars into your business, it's not trivial pressure.
One of the key things when you're doing it yourself, never get in over your own head, because the pressure can be life-threatening. My own example, I was 25, living in the former Soviet Union. We put in 10K each, 5 of us put in 10K each. We built the first Class A real estate in the Soviet Republic of Georgia. And as soon as we finished and the Western National came to rent the space from us, our Georgian partner, who had put in no money, he was just local, he said, I can pay you each your 10K you put in plus an additional 10K and you can leave now, or I can pay you the 10K you put in and you can leave now. And that was sort of at the point of a gun. So we all said, we'll take we'll double our money, we'll go get out. I then took that money as a 26-year-old and gave it to someone else who I thought was a friend. And that 26-year-old has never spoken to me ever again in my life and took my 20K. So easy come, easy go. I have my life, no bullets and no bankruptcy. I'm cool.
That's a great story. I just wanted to make a quick point also, because most of the students are engineers. They come from the perspective, at least myself, I'm trained as an engineer myself. I always came from the perspective of not really thinking about the financial side of things. So it's really about, okay, what difference can we make, right? Technologically, let's say some key difference, like how do we get clean water to all the villages around the world, right? Or something like that. So my goal with this class is also to have the engineers see your perspective, because it's really a different way of thinking from your side. So I'd really appreciate all of you kind of talking about your experience, because, for example, I didn't know what a venture capital was when I was an undergrad, right? So I mean, now it's probably different, but I'm just saying, so it's even more, I would say, lopsided, I think, from the engineering side than you expect. Notwithstanding what we hear in popular news, about Google or Facebook, whatever. Yeah. So
Josh, I totally get that, what you're saying. I'm shocked at people's financial literacy. Just because I spent so many years on Wall Street, I kind of assume that everybody understands those things. And then going into the real world and working with PhDs and mostly and physicians and these brilliant brilliant scientists that I've been so lucky to work with over the years, and just seeing how little they know about even personal finance.
Yeah.
So I think that's really wise to make sure that if you're an engineer, an entrepreneur, learn accounting,
Yeah.
learn about the stock market, learn about how companies are funded, but even just your personal financial literacy. I'm yelling at all of my female friends all the time. I'm like, you don't get to be financially illiterate. Sorry, learn it.
Yeah. And Phil raised a really important point, because as engineers, we actually go through a very rigorous training procedure, so which allows us to really do problem solving in many different regimes. And that's the part many engineers don't realize. And I'm hoping that the students can kind of open their eyes to that possibility. So thank you.
Kirsten and Cassidy are on the call, so they're going to hear things that I've said multiple times before. But to me, it's really simple. And in the historic TVC, whenever I've looked at the technologies, almost universally, these questions are not answered, and they're simple. Yeah. One is, what's the size of the market? Like, I have a thing. How many people am I going to sell it to, or businesses? And you don't have to overanalyze that. You don't need to go buy an analyst report. Usually you can, if you find someone on this panel who has some experience in one of those industries, or somebody who knows someone, within a couple of 15-minute conversations, you can get a feeling for the size of the market. Size of the market. How is my product uniquely designed to actually do a better job? So how is it unique compared to everything else? So it might be cool, and it might do this really, but how compared to what's out there is it unique? And how is that valuable? Does the customer care? Because this is the other thing, and I know this because I am a trained engineer. Engineers love working on cool stuff. Oh, so cool. But back to the value that I said before, does the customer actually care? Like, it might be the coolest whiz-bang, highest tech. I mean, Germans are notorious for over-engineering things. Like, they engineer something so it's perfect, but many times it costs 3 times as much as, let's call it, the Americans who design something that is actually good enough. So you can over-engineer something and it's a beautiful solution, but the customers don't care. So market size, how does it uniquely solve the problem? And you have to understand the competitive landscape. If you're working on something and you're thinking about it, and again, these things you don't have to have a degree in, you don't have to have like Melissa's experience in analyzing companies to be able to do that. Like, you can do that in a few hours in an afternoon, especially with some coaching, like the basics, is this a good idea or is this not a good idea? This isn't how do I fine tune the business? This is just, is this a good idea or not? And so those are my rules of thumb: market size, uniquely solving the problem, and what is the competitive landscape? And if you haven't done that, you're not ready to think about whether or not it's a business, no matter how cool the technology is. That's my perspective. And almost every single technology I've looked at the U, even when I talk to the professors and ask them those questions, they don't have the answers. But my technology is so cool. Like, yeah, but business people don't care because you haven't actually said whether customers care.
So Phil, let me add that in my experience, the best marketing folks, kind of addressing what you're describing, are actually the ones who are trained as engineers. Because when they take their engineering training about creating a hypothesis, testing it, then going back, creating another hypothesis, testing it, and layer that on top of understanding what the market is and how actually consumers respond, rather than creating some new gizmo, but understanding how to address a market, access it, fulfill unmet needs in such a way that you can actually make money. The engineering skills are dead on accurate. I mean, it requires some training to take an engineer and make them think about solving a market problem versus solving an engineering problem. But the ones who can make that pivot are exceptional marketers.
That's really interesting, David. Here's one of the things I've noted, and it's actually 180 degrees from that. But it mostly applies to market sizing, because at least sort of analytical people, when you say, hey, let's go estimate this market size, they're like, well, where's the website where I look that up?
Well,
And
so
it's
So,
like,
Kevin, maybe so I freely admit I've made this mistake, and I still make this mistake. But what really helps is some coaxing. So some way to just align the way we think to solve that particular problem. I think that's where David's coming to. So someone like David is really,
well, and
really good at doing that. I
my
think.
experience is that people that are creatives, actually people who are like have some kind of artistic streak, sometimes when it comes to estimating markets, are really good because they're super creative. Like they're like, you know what? I'm just going to go call 10 people in that it could be random customers and talk to them. Right. And so sometimes creatives actually come up with really interesting ways to estimate market sizes, because the market, if you're actually have a product that's in a market that's not well defined, you're going to need somebody creative to sort of like, how do we do this? It's like a full on whiteboard exercise.
well,
No.
there's a difference between calculating the market size is one thing, but calculating the addressable market is the really relevant aspect. The people that are going to buy whatever you're making.
Right.
And the skill set to do that, when people think of marketing, they think of sales, and that's different, dramatically different. Because the folks that can do the hardcore marketing, the quantitative analysis, if I put 14 inputs into this bucket, I'm going to get 28 sales out, right? That's marketing. That is not sales. And the folks that can do marketing and sales, both of them are rare, really rare. And so the engineers that I've experienced, except for generally are more marketing side rather than sales side. But that's just been my experience.
So I'm going to ask my second question in the interest of time. I know there's so much to so many exciting things to discuss, and maybe Kevin, you can jump in here first. How did you hire the best people possible? And again, this might be related to mistakes you made. You hired poor people as well, right? So do you want to chime in very quickly? And Melissa, I saw the question in the chat. So if you want to answer that after, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
The chemistry of the team is really, really important. You have to find, especially when you're small, you have to find people who have complementary skill sets to what you don't have and add value to what you're trying to do, and yet are married into the passion and the mission of what you want to do. Sometimes it's just pure luck that you come across the right people that fit with the company. The other times it's like you end up going through a Rolodex of friends and family and other people in the industry through your network to find the right people that have the skill sets to come to work with you. It's not always perfect. I can tell you we've had some what I thought were going to be great hires that just never really connected and flamed out. We've had other ones where you thought, no, it's okay, and they've turned around and flourished in the role. And so it's sort of a crapshoot.
So in your experience,
Bullet, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, what would you say is a common characteristics of the most successful hires? Maybe looking back.
Team cohesion's been by far my biggest factor that's helped me with the team. A high performing team, you can give.
So like
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
You can take a high performing team and give them a really crappy project and they'll make it successful. You can take the best all-star team that doesn't have the right chemistry, whatever, and give them a great product to go with and they fail. So it's really finding that cohesion. At least it's worked for me that way, that, when I've had a high performing team that really came together, we did well.
I can't
How about you guys?
Agree with that enough.
Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree with that enough. And the asterisk I add to that is always look for people that are far brighter than you. You can't learn from, don't hire people to boost your own ego. Hire people that's going to make you better.
Yeah.
Yeah, surround yourself.
Anyone else, David?
I would add that I look for people who have a high tolerance for ambiguity and who have a history of success in their previous endeavors, whatever they happen to be. I mean, if they're straight out of college, I want the ones who are the captain of the crew team, or I want the ones who are the leader on the ski team or whatever else they were, or among their peers, they're the ones who solve problems and lead teams. And in small companies, you need people who solve problems and can lead teams. So I apparently have Vice President Pence's fly. So
That's really good advice, Dave.
Melissa, do you want to chime in? What's your experience looking back at your
I mean,
best
I would
hires?
say, I think that a lot of mistakes that at least that I feel like I've made on different executive teams is not, firing people soon enough. I think a lot of times you can sense when you've made a wrong choice. And when at least I feel like most people I've worked with, the tendency is to try to work it out. And sometimes it's just not a good fit, even if it's not a bad person, it's just not the right chemistry. Like Kevin was saying. And I also I agree with the deficit hiring, try to hire people that make you complete, that fill in your blind spots and that, but I also, it sounds Pollyanna, I really like working with people that I like. So,
you have to spend a lot of time with them. So
yeah, you spend a lot of time with them and you have to really trust them and you have to really know each other and be vulnerable. But
Melissa, we've always had to fight against hiring people that we like because they're just like us, right? And that's not the foundation of a high performing team. You have to have diversification across multiple levels. And like at my companies, we've had to create structures to prevent us from saying, oh, she seems like a really good guy, we should hire her, right? Because we like her. I'd like to have a beer with her, right? And that doesn't necessarily solve the problems. So we don't discourage finding people that we like, obviously, but we had to intentionally downplay that as a factor in our hiring decisions, so that we could eliminate the groupthink.
Oh yeah, it's a little too close to election day for the beer with comment, but I understand what you're talking about 100%. If you're trying to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion,
it's not just diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's like it's more like the people who think differently than me are not the ones that I'm naturally going to have an affinity toward, but those are the ones I have to have on my team if we're going to be successful. I mean, all the stuff about being respectful.
How do you do that? This is a great point. Yeah. How do you do this? Yeah, I've found this hardest myself, and I know Paul was asking the same question, right?
How do I do it?
Well, I two things. How do you hire somebody, but then somebody who's getting hired, how does that person distinguish themselves, knowing that that's the type of thing being looked for? Like on paper, I have never, ever gotten a job. I've had about a dozen jobs, and every single time it was a friend who hired me. No one's ever regretted hiring me, but no one's ever hired me who didn't know me.
Well, was that question targeted at me, Rajesh?
For everybody in hiring, like the students who are going out and want to be in an entrepreneurial startup or in a new co or a growing company or, get funding, like how do we, if we don't have track record and pedigree, I didn't go to Princeton, I wasn't an investment banker, I didn't have a family connection, I didn't have my own money, right?
What would you advise?
When I think about people that I like to be around, it's not people that I necessarily want to hang out with, like in my free time. What I look for is people that I respect, and I respect people that also are willing to challenge the norm. So I want some people on my team that are smarter than me and willing to be a bit disruptive and challenging. But I respect them and I enjoy working with them. Doesn't necessarily mean I like them, like we're going to hang out on the weekends, but absolutely love the challenging. And so perhaps that's slightly different, but I have to feel comfortable with the people that I'm working with. And to me, it's sort of a respect, and there's some vulnerability, especially when you're the leader. I'm a big believer that you have to be the one that's willing to show everyone that you're not always right and you're going to take responsibility when things go wrong. But that also means the people that are challenging on your team might, stick the knife in a little bit deeper, not in a bad way, but there's going to be some confrontation, but that's what makes things better, is it's a little confrontation. It has to be respectful.
Yeah, just like we are seeing here, we have lots of different views. So really, again,
Let me just add one more thing, Rajesh. I think the other common thing that's really
the question directed to Melissa. Sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
I said one of the things that's really important is trust, because trust is the glue that keeps the whole organization together. You're trusting someone with your essentially passion and livelihood for who knows how long, and that common bond of trust across the team. And to Paul's point, I think Paul has gone in and demonstrated to people that he's met that, hey, he's someone that they can build trust with, and that's why he's been successful once he's been introduced to someone. So that's what I look for, is that ability to find somebody I can trust.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, I would say I think I mean, there's so many different, again, like every person is different. So the way one person interacts with another, there's an infinite possibility of a race here. So we can't answer them all, but I think all the different perspectives are really valuable, I think, for all the students. I don't want to forget. So Melissa, do you want to address the question from Prate? Prate, first, do you want to ask the question very quickly?
So hi. So I heard once Melissa mentioned that going head to head with the market leader is tough. So I was thinking that as a first product of an entrepreneurial firm or being an entrepreneur, does it make sense to only look for product that I think will have the most market share or like have a huge customer base? Or is it also like to think about what are the market leaders or what are the challenges going forward that market share is going to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that both. I would say kind of what Phil said about the competitive landscape, that doing that analysis is super important and knowing who you're up against. I mean, I think that's what he was talking about, figuring out who else is trying to do what you're doing, who are the leaders. What would everyone else say?
Great. Thank you, Melissa. I realize that I know I have everyone till we're almost out of time, but I want to ask a very important question. I think before we wrap up is, how I skipped one, but how can we help the new upcoming entrepreneurs? I wouldn't say young, because older people can also be very innovative. How can we help them succeed as in your case as experienced entrepreneurs and thought leaders? In my case as a professor, like what can we do to help? Even in current times with COVID, but also also locally in Utah, but also as our country and as a planet. So I want to hear everyone's views on what you think really long term, right? I'm thinking like 10, 15, our kids' generation, our grandkids' generation. What do each of you think that we can do now to lay the foundations? Whoever wants to go first. Okay.
Thanks for the lightweight question, Rajesh. Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, you guys are experts. I really want to learn. Yeah.
I don't know how to solve most things, but what I do know is that when people open up and are offering to help each other, greater things happen. And that perhaps that's a little bit touchy-feely. But I said earlier about building your network. And so my advice for how life on this planet could be better, if people were to try to network a little more actively and offer help to others, even if they said, I'm gonna take an hour a week and open up a time slot, 2 30-minute time slots to help someone else. I think that if people got into the practice of that, if they're not doing it already, I think that actually creates just more for the collective good, because everybody has experience. Most people aren't competing with each other, right? So you just make it better by offering yourself to someone else, even a tiny piece of yourself, to help and give advice.
Fantastic. I completely agree with that. David, I know you have an opinion on this, so I'm very curious.
On this one, I would focus people on areas where there's friction in the economy, where there's a problem that needs to be resolved. Sure, we can go for Googles and Facebooks and stuff where you're creating whole new markets, but for every home run swing like that, there's 1,000 misses. And if we want Utah to grow really fast, I'd really like to get lots of doubles, lots and lots and lots of doubles, rather than try to swing for home runs and unicorns. That's how entrepreneurs learn. So if you find an area where something just doesn't work right, you can say, like at my first company, we looked at the market and we saw Western Union and MoneyGram were charging people sending money to other countries like 8 to 10% of the value. So the amount of money that got to the people who actually needed it was way less than we thought it should be. There's a lot of friction. And if we could figure out ways to use new technologies to eliminate that friction, we knew we could build a good company. Okay, so that we found a problem. We found the technology to solve the problem. We built the company around that. And then we sold it to Citibank. Okay, I mean, that's just, but if we could get people to focus on problems rather than just on technology, I think we'd do better.
Yeah, that's a great advice for engineers because we definitely tend to be more technology centered. So
yeah, like a gazillion of the TVC and Pivot or whatever we're going to call them now, companies or technologies are technologies looking for solutions rather than technologies that were targeted as solutions, targeted to be solutions to problems. And so if you're looking for, I mean, it's a soft answer, but that's the best I got.
No, thank you. Yeah. Melissa or Kevin, if one of you want to chime in.
I would just, oh, sorry, please, Kevin, go ahead.
I think probably the best advice is to look at your career as a journey, not as going to one destination. You have, like David did, you may have several startups that you evolve through. So don't look at your first one as being a home run and going for everything. It's building blocks along the path. And so I think that's, and I'm here to help and talk to anybody. We've all received battle scars, and Melissa talked about that earlier. We've had the wounds on our back from mistakes that we've made. We can certainly share those with other people and help them. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I would just say that there is also a lot of examples of companies that they thought they were solving one problem, and it turns out that there's a whole different problem that they've invented a solution for. So, prospectively, inventors don't always get it right with what the market is going to want. And that's okay, to use the verb pivot in that sense. There's a lot of success stories.
Melissa, was it you who was talking about failing fast, or was that one of the other?
That was Kevin, but it's something I totally believe in, and getting data as early as you can from real people or real customers or real whatever you're trying to sell into.
And that's a good engineering trait, is to be able to create the actual, pinpoint the assumptions you're making, test them as fast as you possibly can so you don't burn too many cycles before you figure out that you're wrong. Because I can almost guarantee you're wrong. I'm always wrong. Every single time I'm wrong. There's no question about it. Like if you went back and looked at any one of my initial plans, they're just so wrong over and over again.
What do they say? Garbage in, garbage out with all of our models, market sizes, but it's the same thing with people. You'll get some hires wrong and you need to make the change fast. Same thing.
So what is it? Slow to hire, quick to fire. You heard that before?
Yep. I totally believe that.
Yeah.
I also think there's an element of gratification. And that's one of the huge challenges that we have right now as individual society, is this idea that everything's instantaneous. Nothing comes fast. And it means you might get fired really quickly. That's about the only thing that happens fast in our world.
So if I were to kind of distill out the thoughts, maybe can I say something like, it would be very helpful for us to have a community of mentors who can essentially, if folks, young or old entrepreneurs want to kind of come to and kind of access this vast data bank of knowledge, experiential knowledge and mistakes. And maybe that's a good way to summarize. I mean, there's a lot of things here. So I'm just trying to still distill what we could do, again, at the university and so on, to really, really, I know Paul and team are doing a lot, but what more could we do to really help folks? But, you know, is there something, is that a reasonable summary, or I'm not?
It's a big subject, Rajesh, right? I don't know that, I mean, I think that that's an acceptable one, but I think trying to summarize, you know, after I said my thing and I listened to David's, I'm like, no, David's right. You know, you got to start with you got to start with the customer problems for sure. But I do think that there's an opportunity for a lot of people to share, and I think there's a lot of people that want to share but really don't know how to, or don't know how to carve out, like, you know, I've got lots of colleagues from my career, and they don't share to them they don't mentor, but they don't even know how they would do that.
Yeah.
Right? If they said, all right, I'm going to free up an hour, tee up those questions. They don't even know where to go to try and donate that hour. If that
so what I see is that now you just identified a problem in the ecosystem of entrepreneurship.
Right. There's probably a business that's you could probably make money.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, seriously. You could
Yeah.
You could probably get executives to actually pay to have someone organize their hour that they would donate. They would consider it a donation. Probably could. That's not a joke. I mean, that's a business idea.
No, I'm not laughing because it's a joke. I'm laughing because I'm happy that we came to some interesting conclusions here.
I think you're write that down.
Paul, this is something we should follow up. I would so first of all, I know we went way past time, and I'm so thankful to all of you, and I really, really appreciate the time that you spent. And personally, I've learned a lot, and I'm 100% sure that the students have as well. And, you know, thank you so much for just being candid in your answers and giving and expertise. And I assume it's okay if the students contacted you if they have any questions or requests for advice going forward. And thank you. And thank you again so much. I might invite you all for the final presentations from the students. If you are free, welcome to join. I'll send an email out.
That would be wonderful. That would be terrific. Thanks, Rajesh.
Thank you, Paul. And thanks, everyone. Really, really appreciate it.
Students, good luck with navigating this craziness. Good luck with everything, and definitely, you know, reach out if you need some feedback on something. Yeah.
Hope to meet all of you in person. It's normal.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.